Okay, so hello and welcome everyone. So in this video, I'm going to do an example of a two-part tariff problem. And so this is a situation where you would have maybe two groups of demanders and you'd have to come up with the optimal two-part tariff. And so I built this into a sort of relatively elaborate problem, which is good. Give us lots of practice. So, okay, suppose we are considering your optimal pricing decisions as a firm with marginal cost of $14 and fixed costs of $400. Initially, suppose the firm determines half its consumers have demand of quantity is equal to 90 minus 3p and half have demand of quantity is 120 minus 4p. Find the optimal two-part pricing scheme when it cannot distinguish between consumers but decides to set price equal marginal cost of $14. Then find the profits. And I say for simplicity, assume that there's just two consumers total. And let me read through the rest of these and then I'll talk about approaching them. So continue to suppose half the consumers have this demand, half have the other demand. Find the optimal two-part pricing structure when it cannot distinguish between customers and it wants to serve both groups while no longer necessarily setting price equal to marginal cost. Then find the profits. And then lastly, continue to suppose we've got same demand structure and suppose we have the unlikely circumstance where we are actually able to distinguish between consumers and therefore establish a separate two-part pricing offer for each group. So this would be like you have the same conditions as third-degree price discrimination, only now rather than just sending a single price to my two groups, students and ordinary consumers or visitors and locals, we give them their own two-part tariff offer. Okay, so let's take a look. Just thinking about the structure of this problem. For part A, what we're interested in doing is we're going to be setting price equal to marginal cost, price equal to 14, and then we're going to set the tariff, the fixed component, equal to whatever is the consumer surplus that arises at that price, right? So we're going to be calculating the area of a triangle, and that is going to be our entire producer surplus, our entire profit. Why? Because if we set price equal to marginal cost, price equal to 14, there's no per unit profits. Okay, so now we have a choice to make in A. We have to decide, do we want to set our tariff equal to the most that our high valuation consumers will pay, and then basically only serve them because it's too large relative to our low valuation consumers? Or do we want to set a tariff that's going to be conducive to our low valuation consumers and be able to get that from both groups? So we have to run those calculations and figure out which is going to be optimal to actually do it, and then we'll determine which one is superior. For part B, this is going to be the situation where I'm going to intentionally serve both groups. I'm going to do this by shrinking the two-part tariff down, or by shrinking down the tariff component to be smaller than what my high valuation consumers would maximally pay. I'm going to make sure that I'm able to get it from both groups, and then because I know that I'm kind of in some sense giving a discount on the access fee to my high valuation consumers, I'm going to try to make back as much as I can on the per unit profit end, hopefully without discouraging my low valuation consumers. And then part C, part C where we're able to distinguish between our groups. This is like third degree price discrimination. We've now got the two different groups. With your ID card, you say, oh, I'm a student, oh, I'm not a student, and then you give your respective offer to those two groups. What that essentially allows us to do in part C is we just have two segments of demand that we can isolate and treat individually as a homogeneous group of demanders, right? So in that case, that's really easy. We're just set price equal to marginal cost, and then the tariff is just whatever is the consumer surplus at that price. Okay, so now let's take a look at the problem. So I'm going to go back up to part A. Again, this is where we're making the decision, do we want to serve all at the low tariff price, the tariff coming from our low demanders, consumer surplus, when price is equal to marginal cost, or do we want to serve only our high demanders? Okay, so first, suppose we only serve high valuation consumers. So the first part here, we're setting price equal to marginal cost of 14. Why? Oh, because I said here we decided to set price equal to marginal cost of 14. So that's why. Okay. So now once I've done that, I have to find the consumer surplus that results at that price. So here's my picture of my low group of demanders, right? So their demand, my high group of demanders, sorry. So here was their demand, Q is equal to 120 minus 4P. Let's find the inverse demand. That's what I'm actually going to graph, right? I should have labeled this. This is price here. This is quantity. That was terrible. So sorry. Okay, so this is price, 30, and this is quantity, 120, right? So when quantity is 0, price is 30. That's here. When price is 0, quantity is 120. We could give away 120 for free, essentially. Okay, so here's consumer surplus that results at this point. Actually, this is really bothering me. So let me see if I can draw on there. No, that's a terrible idea. That's a terrible idea. But I've had worse. Oh. Hey, that looks kind of like a Q. Okay, good. Okay, I'm really regretting doing that in the middle of the video. Okay, so here's price, here's quantity. We found our resulting consumer surplus at this price. So to do this, we're going to calculate the area of this triangle. So 1/2 times 30 minus 14. Where's that coming from? It's the difference between 30 and 14, right? And then what's the 64? This is going to be the quantity that's associated with this price, right? So when we set a price of 14, our high valuation consumers are going to buy a quantity of 64, and that's what their surplus is computed over. All right, great. So consumer surplus is 512, but remember we had fixed costs of 400. So if we sell only to our high valuation consumers at this tariff access price of 512, our profits are 112, which is actually not going to be great relative to what we can get if we serve both. So suppose we serve both. Again, this should be price, but I learned my lesson, so I'm not going to try to label that. And this is quantity. Again, learned my lesson. So price is still price equal to marginal cost of 14. We find the resulting consumer surplus for our low group of demanders at that price. So it's going to be 1/2 30 minus 14 times 48. Why? Well, it's the area of a triangle, 1/2 base times height. That's where the 1/2 is coming from. It's 30 minus 14 because this is going to be price, and then 48 is the quantity, right? Okay, so we find that the area of this triangle is 384. That would be the tariff that we'd be able to maximally get from our low group of demanders. Well, of course they're going to buy, but then also our high group of demanders are going to buy as well. And so I'm going to get 2 of these. So I'm going to say now my profit is going to be 2 times 384, and then minus the fixed cost of 400, which is 368. Okay, so that's better. That's better than 112. So this is at least in the direction of what we'd want. So for part A, what you would want to do is you'd want to sell to both groups with the access fee equal to 384 based on the consumer surplus of our low valuation consumers at the price equal to marginal cost of 14. So that was part A. Okay, remember part B was where we wanted to serve both groups, but we're going to be raising price above marginal cost. So in order to do this, what we need to do is we want to first write down the tariff portion, write down consumer surplus of our low group as a function of price. So first what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a look. I'm going to say, oh, well, I can just replace this 14 with P. And if I do this, well, rather than having 30 minus 14, I have 30 minus P. And then right here, well, I know what this is. This is just my demand. So that's going to be 90 minus 3P. That's this right here, whatever is this quantity. And you realize as we raise P, right, quantity is going to shrink by the law of demand, or as we shrink P, right, quantity is going to rise by the law of demand. Great. So here's consumer surplus now as a function of price alone. Right, so it's going to be 3/2 30 minus P squared. Why? Well, let's factor out a 3 here, 3/2. And then this is 30 minus P squared. Great. So the second part is we're going to write profit as a function of price. Okay, so I say let's write profit in terms of P, because ultimately what we want to do is we want to find what's going to be the optimal price. And that optimal price is going to determine 2 things. It's going to be our per unit price, but it's also going to be it's going to give us our tariff, because we've written the tariff portion as a function of that price. Okay, so profit as a function of price is going to be 2 times consumer surplus of my low group as a function of price. Wait, why 2? Because I'm going to be able to sell to both my low and high demanders. This is my tariff right here. This is the fixed portion. I'm going to 2 times that entry fee essentially. And then P minus MC, this is going to be my per unit profits, right? This is markup times the low demand. And then here's markup times the high demand minus fixed cost. Right? So think about where your profits are coming from. Your profits are going to be the access fee. You're going to get that twice. Then it's going to be your per unit profits from each group. So in the case where we have price equal to marginal cost, this drops out, right? That's 0 times the demands. And then you just subtract off the fixed cost. That's what we did before. But now we're going to let price be higher than marginal cost. There's going to be some positive markup. And this is going to, and essentially what's going to happen is we're going to be extracting per unit profits from both of these groups. Okay, so let's go ahead and do this. What I need to do is I'm going to first plug in the actual expression that I have for our tariff, right? 3/2 30 minus p squared. That was from above, right? We found this from the area of the triangle I pointed. Can't really see that. Great. And then we have price minus p minus 14, and then the demand for my low group, and then we have p minus 14 times demand for my high group minus my fixed cost of 400. Okay, so now we take our first order condition. So differentiate with respect to price, set that equal to 0, and find the price that makes that a true statement. So taking the derivative, right, I actually did some things kind of clever here. So first, I canceled this. I have a 3 here. When you take the derivative, 2 times 3 is 6. Then it's 30 minus p times the derivative of the inside minus 1. Then this right here, this is just product rule. So I recognize when I take the derivative of this thing, this becomes 1. This p becomes 1. So I'm going to get the demand times 1 minus, and then when I differentiate this thing, I'm going to get what? Minus 3 times p minus 14. Okay. And I'm going to do the same thing over here. Product rule again, take the derivative, I'm going to get the demand times 1, which is the derivative of p with respect to p. And then I'm going to get, what, a minus 4 times this p minus 14, right? So I've got that. And then what's the derivative of minus 400 with respect to p? 0, right? It's a constant. Okay, from there on, it's just some algebra. And so I multiply this minus 1, and I flip these things over. So now I get 6p minus 180. I find if I screw this up, it's here, right? So it's this sign right here. Very often I might forget about this minus 1. So if you find yourself making a mistake, that's one place to kind of police yourself. And then some of these other sign errors are pretty easy to commit as well. So pay attention to that. But anyway, so if you follow through the algebra and clean this up, it cleans up pretty nicely. We get prices equal to 16. And then, okay, that's my optimal per unit price. With that, I can evaluate my consumer surplus of my low valuation consumers at that price, and I can get the optimal tariff, 294. Okay, now I've got all the components necessary to compute my profits. So 2 times 294, why? Well, I'm selling to both of my consumers at this access fee, plus 2, why 2? Well, my price is 16, my cost was 14, so I just wrote in 2 here. And then I have 90 minus 48, or 90 minus 3 times 16, so 90 minus 48, and then plus 2, 120 minus 4 times 16, minus 400. If you do this, great. This boils down nicely to 384. And if you recall, hey, look, 384 is greater profits than what we had here, which was 368. And that's as we'd expect, right? So so we're better off serving both groups at this optimal price. Okay, now the last case, suppose we can give each segment its own offer, right? So we separate the two groups into their own we separate the two segments of the demand, and we isolate them by giving them their own offer. It's a little bit different than we usually think of with second-degree price discrimination. Usually with second-degree price discrimination, everybody sees the same menu and then self-selects. But here we're going to say, oh, okay, so suppose we can combine third-degree price discrimination with two-part tariff. We're essentially practicing third-degree price discrimination in that we're segmenting off our demanders. We're giving this group their own tariff, this group their own tariff. So let's do that. Well, we already know what the results are going to be, right? So when we have these two groups that we're keeping separate, we can treat them as their own respective group of identical demanders. And when that happens, right, we want to set price equal to marginal cost and then fully extract the surplus. Well, we've got the price because we got the marginal cost, it's 14. And then we already calculated the consumer surplus that results in both groups when we do this. For our low demanders, their consumer surplus was 384. For our high demanders, their consumer surplus was 512. So the beauty of this now is that, well, I'm going to offer the same price to the two groups, but I'm going to charge different access fees to them. And I'm going to be able to get 384 from one group, and I'm going to get 512 from the other for a total of 896 minus my fixed costs of 400. My profits are 496. Right? Now there's no per unit profits because we set price equal to marginal cost, but this is the optimal situation where we'd be able to fully extract profits by setting price equal to marginal cost. Okay, so that's the last part of this problem, and in comparison, yeah, this 496 would be much higher than this 384, but clearly the information requirement to be able to make this happen is a lot higher, right? You essentially need to be able to practice third-degree price discrimination. And if you have that ability, then wonderful. If not, what you'd have to do is you just set out the offer in the two parts, the access fee and then the per unit fee, and then you'd have your consumers self-select into whichever combination was best for them. And that's kind of what we did with part A. So, okay, very good.